an employment counselor facilitator with the neighborhood group community services. And just in case you don't recognize the neighborhood group, it's actually an amalgamation of uh, what was originally Neighborhood Link Support Services, Central Neighborhood House, and St. Stephen's Community House. So my first slide shows, as you can see, a drop of water falling and rippling outwards. And I like to start with this because it is my belief that this is exactly what we do in the work we do. For every person that we meet, that we have an impact on, whether that impact is positive, negative, or neutral, we have an impact on each person. And what we strive to do is make those impacts more positive. So this is kind of a foundational belief that I move with. So who is Michelle Adams? If you look at the diagram to the right, you will see that we can describe ourselves in many ways. And Victoria, when she takes over from me, will tell you a little bit more about how we can describe ourselves and the idea of intersectionality. I have chosen a few of those this morning to describe myself. So, Michelle Adams, I am female, I'm a mother, I'm an immigrant. With respect to work, I am presently a career counselor, facilitator. I'm also an educator. And I am a lifelong learner. I believe that I learn something from every person that I meet. I learn something new every day. I'm also a little bit of a tree hugger, just so that you know, a little bit of an environmentalist. Also, I have to say, I was a little more involved in the whole process a little earlier on in life. I've taken more of a more passive approach right now. So I can describe myself in this way, but you can use any of these and any of these areas to describe yourself. Just to let you know a little bit about my background, I actually have a bachelor's in natural sciences, so chemistry and zoology. And what I did in postgraduate is education, and I became an educator. And why I'm telling you a little bit about this background, that's how I got into counseling. Originally, I started to teach high school, and this was in the Twin Islands state of Trinidad and Tobago, and in a city, low-income youth I worked with, and I saw tremendous potential in them. And they didn't see this potential in themselves. And I got into counseling so that I would be able to help others see their potential, realize goals, develop and realize goals. So that's a little bit about who I am. So let's talk a little bit about our topic today. So we're looking at newcomer youth employment. And who are newcomer youth? Well, there's a very broad definition of newcomer youth. And that looks at any individual between the age of 13 and 30 who were not born in Canada. depending on what kind of funding we're looking at, what kind of programs we're looking at in terms of employment, we normally look at 5 years in the country. So that 5-year period is what they determine to be a newcomer, but not all programs stick to that hard and fast rule. Under the age of 13 is normally reserved for the designation of child. So that 13 to 30 age group is what we're looking at. Okay. It's useful, however, to note and when we're looking at employment programming within the city and the province, that age is often dependent on program funding, or I should actually say program funding is dependent on age. So if you're looking at after school programs, for instance, they normally cater to the 12 to 18 age group when they're talking about youth, or the 13 to 18 age group. So school age children. For many municipal funded, so city funded programs, the age describing youth looks at 15 to about the age of 24. Now that is expanding a little bit now, but that has been the cap for a little while. For provincial and federally funded programs, and these are employment programs specifically, we're normally looking at age 16 to 29 in the case of the province, and in case of federally funded programs, we're looking at 16 to 30 inclusive. Okay, so there really is, when we start to look and talk about factors that affect newcomer youth employment, age is a factor, the type of program you are looking at is also a factor that you have to, you as the counselor, you as the person helping the newcomer youth has to look at as well. Okay, so let's get into some of the factors. And what I want to say is the factors are in no particular order. And these are some of the factors, some of the major ones that contribute to newcomer youth employment. And in Toronto, we know that reports show us that newcomer youth employment demographic information shows us that newcomer youth are employed way less than Canadian-born youth in the Toronto area. Okay, so firstly, let's look at the influence of status. And when we're talking about status, we're talking about status in Canada specifically. The first I want to talk about is the undocumented individual. So a person, a youth, who has maybe come on their own to Canada, who has come with family in whatever maybe as a refugee, or maybe as a foreign student. Some individuals are undocumented, or they remain undocumented until they have filed a refugee claim, for instance, and they become a refugee claimant. So when you're an undocumented individual, one of the things that really affects employment is you can't apply for a work permit without some kind of documentation. So that, of course, has consequences on the living situations and various other parts of that young person's lives. What happens sometimes, and Victoria is going to talk a little bit more about this, is that a young person may decide to work a cash job, work under the table, and as a result, that situation may lend itself to employer exploitation. And like I said, Victoria is going to take us through labor exploitation in a little while. So I'm going to go ahead to the refugee claimant. Many people who come to the newcomers who come to the country come as refugees. And once they have gotten that refugee claimant, it's often called the brown paper, once their case has been accepted, they are afforded the ability to then apply for a work permit. So that means their opportunity for work, for seeking employment, expands a little bit. Now I'm saying a little bit because often work permits are not open work permits, and there are restrictions on what a person can and cannot do within a work permit. Also, for many refugee claimants, having a work permit also means that you can't access certain educational programs. So newcomer youth are coming in, they are maybe for whatever reason searching for work, they want to better themselves, but they don't have the status where they can seek the education or better themselves in terms of education. Now, once that refugee claimant has had their hearing and they are deemed, they have a decision where they are deemed a convention refugee or a protected person, they can then apply for their SIN number, a temporary SIN number. And again, there is that expansion in terms of how they can, or what they can do and what they can seek in terms of work and in terms of employment. Right? And then finally, after that step, often the permanent residence comes as the next step with respect to that. And this is when they have more options with respect to study, with respect to education, with respect to being able to develop more skills and develop in terms of education so that they can find work that's maybe more appropriate to their skills, their strengths, their aptitudes. Okay, so as you can see, status has a definite impact on newcomer youth employment, and this is across Canada. But I'm confining right now to what we have seen in Toronto and what I have seen in my time with the neighborhood group. Okay, another big one is credential assessment. So when we think about youth, many of us think about school age youth, and you don't really think about credential assessment. But because youth also goes up to the age of 30, we have many youth that come into the country who have post-secondary education already. So they have first degrees, they have masters, or sometimes even PhDs. Well, unless that designation, unless that education is, their credentials are assessed and they meet the standards in Canada, many times they're not accepted in the, or for the workplace. So these are two well-used credential assessment organizations in Ontario. One is the World Education Services, and they're actually set up across North America. And the second is Comparative Education Services. Now, Comparative Education Services is connected with the University of Toronto. So often, if people are thinking, if youth are thinking about further study, they often directed to the Comparative Education Services because, of course, if a University of Toronto is a place they're looking at to further their education, it makes sense to do their credential assessment with them. A point I want to make, though, is both these credential assessment services come with a price. So they are paid for services. Okay. Often, this is a barrier for newcomer youth because depending on their circumstances and their status, they may not have the financial support for credential assessment. Okay. All right. So two big ones, understanding the labor market and understanding employment systems. These are huge factors when we're talking about newcomer youth. Okay. I'm thinking about myself for a minute. And I came as an adult when I immigrated. And I remember going to an employment service provider very early on when I came because I said, I'd like to see what this looks like. And they spoke to me in the language that we have come to recognize as the norm about the labor market and about resources I could get and so on. And I really didn't understand what they were, the staff member was telling me at the time. Not because I didn't understand the English, because I didn't understand the lingo. I didn't understand the norms, the language of employability skills. What are these employability skills that you're talking about? What are what are you talking about? What employers' needs are, and soft skills and hard skills? Well, I was an adult. I was English as my first language. Can you imagine what happens to a newcomer youth who is coming in to face the same situation and may not have English as their first language, for instance? So when we look at employability skills, when we speak to our clients, our newcomer youth that we're talking to, one of the things I always keep in mind is using suitable language and explaining what we mean, asking clarifying questions so that we understand where they are, what they understand, and what they need to know. Okay, so employability skills and the labor market. Why do they need to find out about what's in the labor market, what the labor market needs, what kind of training they might take, what kind of education they might want to do, and just having those conversations with youth, with newcomer youth, are really important because it helps them make better decisions. And I shouldn't say better. The phrase I should use is more informed decisions. And this is really important. One of the things I'm always saying is it's great to get education. It's wonderful. But when we're looking at employment, you want to be educated in something that you can use afterwards towards employment. So one of the things you would want to do is look at the labor market and not look at it presently, unless you're seeking work right now. But when you're looking at education, you're looking at the future. You're looking at 3 years down the line or 2 years down the line when you've finished whatever education. Are those jobs going to be available still? Okay. And of course, we have websites and we have ways to do that research, to research the labor market. And a lot of our employment programs for youth, for whether they be newcomer or any youth, a lot of those employment programs teach how to do that labor market research so that they can make those decisions. Now, the other thing that was relatively new to me was to build that social networking system. So everybody has heard about the hidden job market. And the hidden job market simply means that, that that networking system that we have when we are looking for employment. Now, how do we build that network? For newcomer youth, it might be very difficult because they don't know anybody. And especially if language is an issue, sometimes newcomer youth are fairly isolated depending on what conditions they're living in and so on. They don't necessarily know how to build that network and to build those relationships so that they can find out about jobs, find out about what their aptitudes are, what their strengths are, what they might be good at. Okay? And as you know, the hidden job market accounts for over 85% of jobs in not only in Toronto, but also in Canada. Many jobs are never advertised. So that's why we build a network. And that's why we teach people, we teach our youth, whether they be newcomer or not, to build those relationships, professional relationships, to find possibilities, to understand a little more, not only about themselves, but what's out there in terms of work. Okay. Socialization, another huge topic. So you will see I have a number of points under socialization. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just some points that have come up as I have worked with newcomer youth, and as our team, I should say, has worked with newcomer youth. So one of the major ones that comes up is language development or upgrade. And again, it goes back a little bit to status. So let me give you an example. A newcomer youth, or any newcomer actually, who is a refugee, who is undocumented, for instance, and is not yet a refugee claimant, while they can access ESL classes, English as a second language classes, they cannot access link classes, which are a different level of language development. So they are boxed in. They have fewer programs available for that language development depending on status. Okay. In fact, some years ago, up to some years ago, I should say, TDSB wouldn't accept refugee claimants, but they are now accepting refugee claimants for their ESL classes and link. Well, they always accepted for the link classes. Okay. Post-secondary education institutions generally will ask for a language assessment once any education has taken place outside of the country. When I first came to Toronto, I came with, like I said, my first degree and some postgraduate work. And I came as a teacher. I went back to study career counseling or career development. And I had to take a language assessment. And not only did I have to take a language assessment, as a part of the program, I had to do college English again. But that is a requirement of the institutions. And whether we like it or not, this is what happens to ensure that certain standards are met. And this is something that newcomer youth have to be prepared for. And that's why when we're having those conversations, it's important that they understand what they might be facing so that they don't get disheartened and frustrated with the systems. Okay. Secondly, social assistance and supports. So many youth have come from different countries where social assistance looks very different. Our social assistance system, even though youth may be shuttled towards that area, for example, a refugee claimant can apply for social assistance and may go into the system. Often, it's not explained, the entire system is not explained to the person, or they don't have an in-depth understanding, not only of the supports that are available to them. And I have to say, caseworkers actually do a good job of explaining supports, but sometimes they don't quite understand how the system works. And that lack of understanding results in misunderstandings, which can lead to things like their Ontario works or their social assistance being cut off or being suspended, I had a case recently, not too long ago, where someone called me and said, my caseworker cut off my social assistance. Okay, so tell me what happened. Well, I've been working for the last 2 months. Okay, and are you working for more than this amount? Well, yes, but I can work. They're supposed to support me still, right? And this person didn't understand that after you passed a certain benchmark, the financial support is affected because you're able to financially support yourself. And that's how the social assistance system is built. Um, so, what he did is he wrote a letter requesting that his assistance be returned because he was laid off after 2 months and didn't quite understand that that's what would happen. So that's just one of the examples. Okay. Another major one, our transportation systems. Toronto is a big city, multicultural, etc. But we're also multi-transport, if I can use that term. Okay. Some newcomer youth have come and they're using subways for the first time or streetcars for the first time. I actually looked at a map when I was developing this presentation. I looked at a map of our subway system and bus system just in Toronto, just the TTC map, and I was confused. So I don't know how many of you, if you ever looked at an entire map of our TTC bus system, may get confused by it. Now, I have to admit, I'm a little directionally challenged, but it can be very confusing for somebody who does not understand that all these systems work together. And when we talk about transportation systems, we also have to talk about the payment systems, because now we use the Presto card, and how many newcomer youth have come from countries that use a card system, and how do we load these cards? And often we make the assumption that because the person is in a certain age group, that they are technologically advanced. However, one of the things I'd like to caution us with is exactly that. There are many youth that have come through, for instance, our programs, where they needed that explanation, but were hesitant to ask, especially when we, the person that works with them, made these what we consider basic assumptions. Okay, so one of the things I have learned in my work with newcomer youth is to never make assumptions. Ask clarifying questions so that you're sure where the person is at, where the youth is at. Okay. Another thing is understanding our social systems in Canada. I put supermarket chains here specifically because I wanted to remember the example I wanted to share with you. So in our YouthWorks program, there is the facility for support with groceries and so. And so a youth can access like a grocery card, for instance. And that happened with a particular youth going through the program. And they were given not a physical card, but a digital card. So it was sent to their email. What we didn't explain was that you can use the card in this group of supermarkets only. So what happened is the person went to a supermarket where the card could not be used. So that was a mistake on the part of the person issuing the card. We assumed. Now, what you could say is, well, the youth didn't quite read the entire card. Well, I'm guilty of also of not reading all the terms and conditions that I agreed to when I started up my last phone, for instance, my new phone. So some of these what we would assume to be basic assumptions are things that we have to explain. I'll give you another example, and this is after I'd been here for some time. I remember around Christmas time one year, my colleague started talking about treats that they share at around Christmas time, and talked about mince pies. That was good. And he said, mince pies, they're so sweet. I don't like them because whatever. And in my mind, I thought, mince pies. Mince pies are not sweet. They're minced meat in a shell. And because of where I grew up, so I grew up in the Caribbean in Trinidad. When we talk about minced meat was minced beef. So in my mind, a minced pie was a minced beef pie. However, to my surprise, a minced pie is actually minced fruit. Well, my colleague had a good laugh at my expense, and I learned something new. I use this example just to show you how often miscommunications occur because we assume knowledge that maybe somebody, whether it be newcomer youth or not, may or may not have. So asking those questions, ensuring that newcomer youth understand what we're talking about is important. So, and that includes the terminology that we use as well. The technology I'm talking about, I actually touched on it before. We assume a lot of times because the age group that we're talking about is between 16 and 30, and they've grown up with what we perceive to be, well, in a technological era, that they have certain skills and they have certain knowledge. But I have also worked with newcomer youth who do not have a standard email address or a professional email address, or do not have a voice message that a potential employer could call and leave a message for if they're looking for work. So these are some of the things we have to keep in our mind when we are assisting newcomer youth with seeking employment and helping them to find their way in terms of career paths and so on. Okay. Another major concern that falls under the umbrella of cultural expectations. So I'm going to come to the diagram on the side in a minute, but for many newcomer youth, there are certain expectations, especially if they've come with families. Sometimes they've come without families, but they are, of course, still connected with their families. There's certain expectations from them. For many of them, that means a specific career path without any idea of the youth's aptitude, their strengths, what they would actually try to like to do, without having those particular conversations. And that's why career exploration is really important as a part of some of these employment programs that newcomer youth look at when they're looking for employment. Now, how does that affect the newcomer youth? Depending on the different cultures that we come from, family is really important, and therefore, by extension, familial expectations are paramount. So many newcomer youth find themselves with education or developing certain skills which may not match their aptitudes. But it's important to the family, and family, like I said, it's almost an extension of ourselves. So whether or not it affects them in a negative way, that's the pathway that they first go to. I've also worked with youth who, after they have been through a program like some of the employment programs we have, go in another direction. And having those conversations with family can be very stressful. Okay. For other youth, or for some youth as well, they are the person or persons bearing the financial burden of providing, of being the breadwinner for the family when they first come to Canada. Now, that could be for a number of reasons. Sometimes parents may not be healthy enough. Sometimes it's language. Sometimes it's something else. Many newcomer youth have communicated to people like yourself and myself that they feel stressed because they have to provide financially towards the family, towards rent, towards the bills. Okay. And it's not just that financial support that can be stressful for you. And remember, this is a time, 16 to 30, when youth are developing themselves, they're developing their independence and they're individuating. So they're becoming adults themselves. And it's a very difficult time for them to have this burden placed upon them. But circumstances being what they are in some families, this is a burden that they bear. Okay. The other kind of support that that I have on the side here is for many newcomer youth, they're supporting family, parents, grandparents, um, other people in their community with as an interpreter, uh, with communication, with technology. They have so many roles in terms of support that sometimes they they get overwhelmed. And that's where I get to the information overload. For youth, it can be very difficult when they're spread so thin in terms of so many different roles. Like I said, it could be family, community, that one of the things they overlook might be themselves and what their strengths are and uh, where they might best fit in the world of work. Okay, so often they take the first job that comes because that's what's going to help whoever it is they have to help. Okay, and of course, this has a direct impact on, I know I have mental health there, but physical and mental health, because those go together. Okay, so out of the many reports I have read, stress is one of the number one concerns that newcomer youth talk about when they are talking about their health and how they feel. And the stress is brought about not only by the cultural or familial expectations, some of it is related to the um, the discrimination that we have in society. Some of our systems are broken, and because of that, newcomer youth uh, uh, don't have the same kinds of experiences as other groups of people when it comes to employment. Okay. The second part of that, when I'm looking at health, is, and of course, I should just put this in here. Um, when you're stressed, I think we all know this, but let me just clarify. When we're stressed, as we know, it affects our physical health as well. How many youth have you spoken to that are dealing with headaches all the time, or maybe things like hair loss, all these are related to stress. There are a number of physical manifestations of stress, as we know. And these are all indicators to us as people who work with youth and newcomer youth that there may be a health concern. And it's physical, but it may be related to mental health. Okay? And that leads us to navigating our health system. So for many newcomer youth, the health system in Toronto and in Canada, in Ontario, sorry, looks very different. And again, with without clear indication, it's sometimes very difficult to navigate the health system. And I'm going back to status again because it impacts, of course, where or what we can access in our health system. Okay, so again, less for the undocumented individual, refugee claimants have a few more or a little more access until they become protected persons or and permanent residents. But for many, they find it easier to choose other kinds of coping mechanisms than dealing with our health system. And not all of these coping mechanisms or coping strategies are healthy or contribute to well-being. Okay, so this again is something we have to look at. Now, if I just go across to the diagram for a moment, you would see how this plays out, what I've been talking about. When we look at the individual, we look at so many aspects of any individual. So with newcomer youth, genetic vulnerability, cognitive ability, physical health, motivation. Oh, one of the things I forgot, sorry, is, and we haven't addressed, is related trauma. For many newcomer youth that are coming to us, we don't know where their past or what has happened in the past, what their journey has been before they come to Canada, before they get here. And dealing with that past trauma sometimes is very important before they can move on. Well, as you know, for many of our, especially the mental health supports, they are already stretched and strained even before the pandemic. So for many people, for many newcomer youth, and many people wanting to access those supports, they're very long wait times. Well, something like trauma, for instance, when we're dealing with or trying to deal with people who have dealt with trauma, there is no timeline for that. They don't fit into well-developed little boxes. There is no indication of what might trigger a person, a newcomer youth, at any point in time. And that's what makes it all the more important to get those supports and get that help before or while they're getting into that employment. Back to the diagram. Sorry about that. So when we're talking about the individual, we're talking about all these things that affect the individual, our newcomer youth. And then as an extension, the family. For some youth, like I said, they're separated from their family. They're here alone for whatever reason. Okay? They're isolated from their family, maybe people in their community, and that has implications. And sometimes that means, like I said, that social networking that we talked about, building relationships, can be quite difficult. Okay. When we're looking at family too, we need to think about parental health and parental support that youth are normally expected to give. Okay, and when we expand that further, we're looking at our systemic barriers. Discrimination that occurs throughout our systems, in various places, in various strata. Okay, be that where we live, so different communities, in our schools, in our houses, housing, in different neighborhoods. So based on our environment, or I should say the newcomer youth, based on their environment, their access to employment may be affected as well. Okay. Now, so one more, those are the ones I actually want to talk about. I actually want to introduce a case study. This is an actual case that we had through the Youth Works program. Name has been changed, of course. And I would actually like to hear a little bit from you as to what you would do. And then I'll tell you what happened with this case. So Fiona arrived in Canada in 2019 from a South Asian home as a permanent resident with her new husband. It soon became apparent they couldn't survive on her husband's salary from his survival job. They were paying market value rent for a small apartment in a neighborhood improvement area or priority neighborhood. So their living conditions were very basic, and I would say also substandard. Okay. Fiona had some post-secondary education in politics from her country of origin, but no paid work experience. She felt isolated, having no family close by, and below average English language skills. This was further exacerbated when the lockdown started during the pandemic. Fiona was also confused about the labor market and how to find jobs here in Toronto. So I guess Fiona reminded me a little bit about me, except she was a lot younger. Okay, so my question to participants, I'm just going to see if anybody has any suggestions. What would you suggest to Fiona? Anybody at all? You can just chime in if you have any suggestions for Fiona. Okay. Okay, so thank you. There's a suggestion here that she join Link to improve her English. Thank you. Yes, that is a good suggestion. Anybody else? Suggestion that she find a survival job where basic English would be okay. Yeah. Okay. So as I mentioned, Fiona actually was a client of ours. And yes, there's another suggestion. Get her credentials assessed and apply for subsidized housing. Absolutely. Um, those are things she could do if she had the money and the time, of course, for subsidized housing. So I'm going to share with you what happened with Fiona. And this is through our youth employment facilitator, Raymond Koyo.
So when Fiona came to us, she was unemployed, living in a priority neighborhood with her husband, who was the only person working a minimum wage position. And one thing that they realized is that, to make it in Canada, both of them would have to work, even though culturally it's a norm that the husband would be the main provider in the household. So she came to us, and what we did was the intake assessment, and we identified her strength in terms of storytelling, some experiences, lived experiences, that we were able to use to tell a powerful story that evoked emotions in the employer's, heart. And we prepared her for the interview. She got a call for an interview and was offered a position with Plan International.
Okay. So Fiona actually went through our Youth Works program, in which there are 6 weeks that they develop skills, employability skills, and so, and worked with staff. And she worked as a donor engagement associate with Plan International for a little while. Did some project management, educated herself, did a project management course, and then moved on to further work in fundraising. So this was such a good example of how some of these programs that we have in Toronto can assist newcomer youth in terms of employment. Okay, and with that, I want to leave you with some of these programs. Okay, so of course, I started with the two that I know best, Youth Works and Opportunity Knocks. And these are federally funded programs with TNG, with the neighborhood group that I work with. And like I said, both of them have a length of time that they do employability skills and then move on to paid work placements, which gives the young person some experience in the workplace. Many employment service providers provide the youth job connection or youth job connection for students programs. And in this one, you can a youth can again develop their employability skills and either look for part-time or full-time employment. For students, it's part-time employment or in summer employment. Toronto Community Housing has started their own program called Youth Works, which again is very similar, does the employability skill development, and the students work over the summer period within the Toronto community housing areas. Toronto Youth Job Corps, again, is a similar program. And the next two, Building Up and Hammerheads, are both pre-apprenticeship programs. Now, they are skewed more to construction, both of them. Building Up also looks at other trades, so they look at plumbing, electrical, things like that. And one I wanted to also mention, because these are often forgotten, if you ever meet a newcomer youth or you were speaking to someone who is on Ontario Works, there are several training programs that are available for youth or youth alone within Ontario Works training programs. Okay, so, and this list, like I said, is not exhaustive. These are just some of the programs I thought I would mention in case you're meeting newcomer youth and you would have some idea as to what some helpful programs that might get them into the marketplace, the labor market. Okay. So with that, I am going to hand you over to Victoria, and she will talk a little bit more about, she'll expand on the labor exploitation and tell you a little bit more about how that occurs. Okay, thank you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for participating in the case study as well.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that really informative presentation. I definitely took some notes as well as you were talking about the different programs available. And I'll definitely be using that as I continue doing this work with youth. So thank you so much for giving that presentation. So before I get started, I would like to ask Nadia if she could share the slides, please. If she could share her screen for the slides. Thank you so much. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Zia. I am the Anti-Human Trafficking Youth Coordinator at the FCJ Refugee Center. Today, I'll be talking about the same topic, newcomer youth wellness and employment, but definitely taking on a different type of side of employment. You can go to the next slide, Nadia. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before I get started, I just want, Yeah, there. Before I get started, I just wanted to just talk a little bit about myself and who I am and just kind of my background. And so I was born and raised in Canada. I'm born and raised in Canada. I currently live in Toronto, Ontario. But I do have Latin American roots. So what that means is my mom is Guatemalan and my dad is Ecuadorian. And so I'm definitely second generation. And so growing up here in Toronto, I definitely had a different experience than what a newcomer faces. 100%. Of course, I had, because of all the path that my parents had built for me and have set for me, of course, I've had many privileges in my life. But the reason why I am in this field of work is because I grew up witnessing the different struggles that both my parents had to face. My mom came into Canada as a refugee, and so seeing how hard she had to work all the time, especially with not having any Canadian experience and not having any educational background. So constantly, I always saw my mom just struggling all the time and working underpaid jobs, working survival jobs as well. And so growing up, I've always witnessed both of my parents struggling, but because of them, I am where I am today. I was able to go to school, go to university, and be in this career that I'm in right now. And so just a little bit of background about my education, I guess you could say. So I did go to Toronto Metropolitan University. At the time, it was called Ryerson. Bachelor's in Arts and Contemporary Studies, a double minor in Sociology and Family Support and Community Practice. I definitely always knew that I wanted to get into community service. I just didn't know what sector. I didn't know what exactly I wanted to do. And so after graduating from Toronto Metropolitan University, TMU, I really was just applying to everywhere. And I didn't at that time realize that where my heart really lied in, I guess I could say, until I got my first job at an NGO, international NGO, as a receptionist. And then there is when I realized I wanted to do international development work. And then that's when I decided to go to Humber College, do a postgrad in international development. And at Humber College, I realized after having many different conversations, and then I realized that I really did love doing international development work, learning more about it. And so for our placement, I ended up finding the FCJ Refugee Center. I ended up volunteering in the English classes, and then I did and in volunteering with English classes, I had many conversations with a lot of the participants. And I realized, I'm like, wow, a lot of these people have gone through similar experiences that I've witnessed growing up from my parents. Right. And so that's when I realized, I'm like, wow, I really want to get into this work. I really want to learn more about this work, about newcomer and migrant experiences, especially because growing up, I've always witnessed my parents going through these different challenges. And so FCJ had a job positioning for the youth worker. And so I applied and thinking as I got it. And eventually I moved up to youth coordinator. So now I am the anti-human trafficking youth coordinator. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, perfect. And so I wanted to go through, was there learning objectives before this, Nadia? Sorry. Okay, perfect. So for learning objectives, so before I get started, I just want to do like a brief outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I won't be speaking as much. Michelle definitely covered so much different parts of employment and the newcomer experience. So I'll definitely won't be speaking as much, but I hope that everyone will learn and receive from what is spoken about today. And so the learning objectives for today is, I'm going to first go through intersectionality and employment. Then I'm going to talk about precarious status migrants and employment. Then I'm going to get into human trafficking, and labor exploitation. And then I'm going to end off with what makes youth vulnerable to labor exploitation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So intersectionality and employment. So as Michelle mentioned in the beginning, there definitely with newcomer youth, it's really important to have this lens of intersectionality. So before I kind of get into that, just for those who don't know what intersectionality is, it's a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw to describe the lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own experience with discrimination and privilege. And so these are just some examples of youth having these intersectional identities. So immigration status, language, race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender identity, religion, mental health, or any other aspects of their identity. So the reason why I wanted to just kind of bring this here into topic is because when we're looking at youth employment and wellness, using an intersectional lens is extremely important. What it means to look at newcomer youth wellness and employment in an intersectional lens, what that means is examining the different practices and the structures that kind of increase the risk of newcomer youth experiencing disadvantage and discrimination when seeking employment. And so because of these intersecting identities. And so I'm sure, as you all know, for those I see in the chat, that a lot of you have experience with working with newcomer youth. I'm sure you have witnessed that a lot of newcomer youth have gone through situations where they are being discriminated against because they don't speak the language, or because of their sexuality perhaps, or ethnicities. And so these all come into play when newcomer youth are seeking employment. And next slide, please. Perfect. And so precarious status migrants and employment. So I'm not going to get into this too much because Michelle did an amazing job going through this. What I just wanted to highlight here is anyone involved in sponsorship breakdown. Those involved in sponsorship breakdown are definitely fall under the precarious status migrants. And so just to kind of give a brief definition of what that means. So sponsorship breakdown is when your sponsor can't or won't provide for some or all of your basic needs, such as food, housing, clothing, or medical care. So when one is in the process of sponsoring their spouse or a common law partner who is in Canada, they must have a work permit to work while their application is being processed. So during this time, there is this dependency that is created, right? Because it places one that is being sponsored in a highly vulnerable situation. And so women who are sponsored by their husbands or partners to come into Canada are in these very vulnerable situations because they are dependent on their partners, their husbands, for food, for clothing, and for medical care. And during this process of receiving a work permit, they're very much dependent on their spouse. And so oftentimes, a sponsor can have the power to decide not to support you anymore, not to support their partner anymore. And so, which is where sponsorship breakdown comes in, right? Where they decide that they won't provide anymore any of the basic necessities to live. And so this makes finding employment a lot more difficult for those being sponsored, or for specifically for women being sponsored, because now there are multiple needs that need to be met, right? So while one is seeking employment, they are trying to fill the need of housing, fill the need of food, fill the need, and oftentimes women come with their children, fill the needs of their children. And so oftentimes there are these multiple different things happening that make it really difficult to find employment during the stress of a sponsorship breakdown. And so unfortunately, women who are involved in sponsorship breakdown are in situations of abuse and are most likely end up in emergency shelters or transitional houses. And so this is just kind of an example of what sponsorship breakdown means, and how employment is affected by sponsorship breakdown. The next one here, I wrote people without status, but of course, Michelle covered this in a great way. She went over it. But people without status are also those who struggle with finding employment as well, because as Michelle mentioned, look for survival jobs or are desperate, and they end up in a job that ends up exploiting them, which goes into the next slide, please. Labor exploitation. And so when bringing up the topic of labor exploitation, as I was putting this presentation together, for myself, being also a part of the anti-human trafficking team, it was really difficult for me not to talk about human trafficking, because human trafficking is something that occurs here in Canada, whether we like it or not. It's right. It could be your next door neighbor. Someone could be in a situation of human trafficking, or it could be a youth that you pass by down the street. And so this is something that happens very frequently here in Canada, but it is not spoken about as often. And so when talking about labor exploitation, I really wanted to just kind of get into the different definitions of what it means, first of all, what human trafficking means, and then what labor trafficking means, and then what labor exploitation looks like. And so here I have the definition of human trafficking. So human trafficking is when someone, usually in a position of power, profits from the exploitation of another person through the use of threats, fraud, coercion, and or deception. This can occur in different forms, such as sex or forced labor. It can also occur in different industries. There are certain industries that we don't realize actually has a lot of labor trafficking. For example, the construction sector. There's also the cleaning sector. When I was doing some research on labor trafficking, I was surprised to find out that even workers who are working at carnivals, who are working at different locations that provide entertainment for people are also could be found in situations of labor trafficking as well. And so it's definitely something that happens here in Canada. And so labor trafficking refers to situations in which people are coerced into working by using violence or intimidation, or by more subtle means such as debt manipulation, withholding of identity documents, or threats to report them to immigration authorities. And so in my role at FCJ Refugee Center, I do, as I mentioned, I do support the anti-human trafficking team. And so a lot of the cases that we receive are labor trafficking. So these a lot of like threats to immigration authorities is definitely something that we see commonly happen amongst victims of labor trafficking, where they feel trapped and they feel like they can't leave this situation because the trafficker is holding their identity documents, whether that's passports or birth certificates. The trafficker refuses to give those back. So they feel like they're stuck there because they can't leave without any form of identity documents to try to establish themselves here. I have worked with cases where there were oftentimes youth were in these situations where they try to establish themselves by getting a Canadian phone number, getting a bank account, but the trafficker refuses to give these identity documents back so that they could have some sort of ID when opening up these accounts. Therefore, they are in an extremely vulnerable situation and they feel trapped and they feel like they can't get out of this situation. And so, like, as mentioned, labor trafficking happens in ways that we don't realize, and traffickers oftentimes exploit and take advantage of youth who are in extremely vulnerable situations. Here I have the definition of labor exploitation as well. So labor exploitation refers to situations where people are coerced to work for a little or no I can never say that word, remuneration, often under threat of punishment. There are a number of means through which a person can be coerced, including intimidation, accumulated debt, retention of identity papers, threat of exposure to immigration authorities. So labor exploitation, as you can see in these definitions, it definitely falls under, obviously, labor trafficking. They're extremely similar definitions, so which is why I wanted to talk about labor trafficking and human trafficking, because labor exploitation is definitely stems from labor trafficking as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so what makes youth vulnerable to labor exploitation? And so anyone can be a target. That is definitely something that's really important to keep in mind. Oftentimes people think like, oh, this can't happen to me. Oh, this can't happen to this person and that person, but anyone can really be a target of human trafficking and labor trafficking and sex trafficking. But there are certain aspects of someone's life that makes them more vulnerable to being victims of labor exploitation, of human trafficking in general. But right now we're talking about labor exploitation. And so there's definitely certain aspects of one's life, certain aspects of one's identity that makes them a lot more vulnerable. And so here are some, briefly, just kind of like a brief list of what makes youth more vulnerable to labor exploitation: language barriers, precarious immigration status, working in remote areas, poverty, discrimination, isolation, unaware of rights, and they're supposed to say precarious living situation and homelessness, a history of abuse, mental illness, and addiction. And so in order to kind of paint a picture of what I mean when I say, youth are more vulnerable while being in these, more vulnerable to labor exploitation because of these different factors, I wanted to bring a case example of a case that we had to work on. And so, as I mentioned, since I'm a part of the anti-human trafficking team, I do support a lot with different anti-human trafficking cases in terms of receiving, doing different immigration applications, and connecting victims to different resources as well. And because I'm the youth coordinator, a lot of my cases, the cases that are being referred to me, are youth. So these are youth that are, the youngest that I've seen is 19, and these are just youth, which is like the youngest that I've been referred. But there are definitely a number of different situations and a number of different cases where youth are found in very vulnerable situations, and therefore it leads to kind of like a trafficking situation. And so just an example of a case that I received, of a youth who was in a situation of labor trafficking. They were in their early 20s. And they had precarious status here in Canada as well. So in this case, this youth did not speak any English. They had difficulty finding a job because, of course, as Michelle mentioned earlier, those who don't have status or precarious status often don't have work permits. And so they had to, so this particular youth was working several different survival jobs, or what we also call like under the table jobs, where they get paid cash. Because they don't have work permits to find a job that perhaps, I guess you could say like more legitimate job or anything like that. And so this youth was desperately looking for a place to live, as they were running out of money to pay for their rent. And so this youth got connected to someone claiming to provide free housing and a well-paying job. Without knowing where they were going, they ended up being transported 9 hours away from Toronto, and with other workers as well. And once arriving to this destination, it wasn't what the trafficker promised at all. So oftentimes in situations of labor trafficking, the trafficker always promises these big things like, hey, you're having trouble with housing, I can provide you housing and I'll pay for it. Hey, you're having trouble with buying food, I can provide you with food and I can pay for it, or maybe I can give you like a discount on the food being purchased. If you're having trouble with this, I can do that. So oftentimes the trafficker is introduced into the victim's life because they are kind of seen as this person that, hey, that can help them out of a very tough situation. And so that was a similar situation with this youth. This youth was in desperate need of a home because they had no money to pay for their rent. They were in desperate need for their needs to be met. right? And they also had a language barrier. They had precarious immigration status. They were in a impoverished situation. They were very much isolated as well. I believe with this particular case, they did have one other family member, but they didn't have any other really social connections because they were constantly trying to find a job and constantly working irregular jobs. And so once they arrived at this destination that was 9 hours away, this youth realized that it wasn't what the trafficker promised at all. So they ended up working 1 full month without getting paid because the trafficker claimed that their wages were being deducted for living expenses and were being deducted for food, even though this youth only received 1 meal a day. And so by the end of that entire month, they were extremely malnourished as well. And they were practically starving all the time because they only ever ate 1 meal a day, and the trafficker didn't provide for this meal. It was the employer where they ended up working that provided this meal out of the kindness of their hearts, right? It wasn't even the trafficker. And so this youth ended up, yes, basically starving, extremely malnourished. And in this particular situation, they also got COVID-19. And so there was a number of things happening here. And then during that time when they got COVID-19, they were extremely isolated. And no one was allowed to visit him or anything like that. Some of his friends, or I guess the other workers, they were the ones that would go out of the way to go get him food and make sure he had something. But again, it was limited to the 1 meal a day, and they all had to get food from their plates and kind of put it together for him. And so this situation, this is something that is very common, and it happens all the time to youth, but also to adults as well. But right now we're talking about youth. It happens to youth. And so it's something that we don't realize that happens here in Canada, especially like in a place like Toronto, but it very much does. And so this is an example of a youth who was vulnerable to being trafficked because of the things that I mentioned, because of language barriers, because of precarious immigration status, because of he was already in an impoverished situation. He was working in a remote 9 hours away from Toronto. In this area where he was working was extremely remote. And so he had no support outside of the workers that he was working with, who are also in that labor exploitative situation. He was very much isolated. He was unaware of his rights. And it was in a precarious living situation. And so this is, as I mentioned, this is just one example of many cases that I've had to personally work with. Even the cases outside of what I worked with, this is a reality that a lot of youth are faced with when looking for employment, when looking for a way to receive an income to fulfill their basic needs. And so I definitely wanted to add this to this conversation about youth and employment, because often it's not spoken about enough. And it's definitely a reality that a lot of youth are faced with on a daily basis, especially being so vulnerable, and especially being targets as well for traffickers too, because of their vulnerabilities. And yeah, I don't know if I have another slide, Nadia, is that okay? And that's it for my part. If you have any questions about what's spoken about, or if you want to know more about the work that we do at the FCJ Refugee Center, we also provide info sessions for youth. Recently, I provided an info session for parents of youth, and we provide info sessions for service providers as well. So if you ever, if you are interested, or if you believe that perhaps your organization might benefit from an info session, or you want to collaborate in some way, feel free to email me here, victoria.cia@fcjrefugeecenter.org. Thank you for listening.